Welcome to part 2 of the lecture about research design. In this part of the lecture, I'm going to actually go more in depth about internal and external validity and some of the threats you can be looking for to those as you analyze research. So remember that internal validity is the snapshot of reality. It's the design somehow needs to apply to real life. And external validity is, can you go outside of the design and actually apply the results to other groups? So for both kinds of validity, there are threats to the validity and how much you can trust the results. These threats are factors that interfere with the validity and the credibility of this study. And if there are a lot of threats or they're very egregious threats, then it reduces the level of confidence you have in the results. Now, keep in mind that we cannot always control all of the threats, but we can recognize them and discuss them if we're going to be credible when we're authoring research. In experimental design, you can control everything but the IV, but that's really hard to find in education where we're working with people. Threat-free research really doesn't exist with human subjects. So instead, we have to minimize the threats. We have to acknowledge and recognize what we did about these different threats to validity. We can still draw conclusions, but we need to consider how much confidence we actually have in those conclusions depending on how many threats there are to the validity. So let's look first at internal validity. There are 11 threats that have been recognized, and you can actually use these as you analyze an article. Pull them up as a checklist from your textbook and consider them as you look at the results that people say they are getting. The first one is history, the threat of history. This means that there are outside events that could be influencing your result. Some examples, if you were doing a study in a classroom or some kind of workplace or pretty well anywhere on 9/11, that would need to be considered as you look at the results, as the whole country just was in shock over what had happened. I grew up in Canada, so if you tried to do a study in my classroom at school when there was a Russia-Canada hockey game happening, we're talking back in the 70s, there's no way you would have had a valid internal validity for your study. Another example would be if you were studying teacher morale and you chose to administer surveys to teachers or do focus groups while their school district was in the middle of some very heated negotiations about their salaries or working conditions, bad timing. That's going to be a huge threat to the validity. Even as something as commonplace as a fire drill, if you're in a classroom with an intervention and all of a sudden there's a fire drill, the kids, either their concentration could be broken, or when they come back in and you start your intervention, they're going to be wound up. All kinds of things like that need to be acknowledged and recognized. The second threat to internal validity is the threat of selection. When you do not have good plans for your subject or participant selection, you can end up with groups that really are not equivalent or even similar enough to each other. And then there's a threat to the validity of the conclusions that you draw. It might influence the results. For example, if students in your control group are on average a few months older than the students in the treatment group, that would be an influence, an extraneous variable that you would need to control for. So you have to consider all of those extraneous variables, like attitude and gender and achievement and socioeconomic status and race and ability. All those sorts of things can become selection threats. There's a threat with maturation, and this simply means that the subjects change naturally over time while your study is being done. This is really a problem with human subjects if you're studying humans during a time of rapid growth and development. For example, if you're doing a study with preschool children, you have to consider all the huge changes that happen in these children with language and dexterity and nap taking and relationships with caregivers and parents. If you were doing a study, for example, on sharing with preschoolers, and you had some kind of activity you had designed to help children learn to share, studying 3-year-olds, you might actually be measuring their ability to communicate about sharing or with each other, rather than actually whether your intervention helped them learn to share. And another problem with maturation is that at certain points in human development, children of only a month difference in age can be incredibly different from each other. So longitudinal studies also have to acknowledge all the things that could be changing in a subject's life, not just the intervention that you were doing. Subject attrition can be another threat to internal validity. Some places, Clark County School District is a good example of this. In some of our schools, the students, there's a high rate of mobility, and students move in and out of schools, and you can lose 20-30% of your subjects just within the case of a short study. And this is really only a problem if it becomes unbalanced. If you lose a whole bunch of students from your control group, that's a problem. If you lose equal numbers, that's not as much of a problem. And so your sample size becomes really critical, because you are going to have attrition. You'll have a student who's ill on the day of the pretest and then or on the post-test, and they took the pretest, and there's nothing that you can do about that. Speaking of pretesting can actually be a threat. That's not to say you don't design a study with pretesting in it, or that a study with pretesting is not as powerful. That's absolutely wrong. But the research designer or researcher has to acknowledge that there are threats that come from pretesting and post-testing. There are actually ways to learn through the pretest. Oh yeah, I remember that question, and so they're familiar with it. Or you could even have a student who saw a question on a pretest and was curious about it and went out and taught themselves something about that subject, especially in today's Google world. And the other problem when you're looking at validity is, if you're going to have a different pretest than a post-test, you have to ensure that they're measuring the same constructs and in the same way. Instrumentation is obviously a big threat to internal validity. You have to look at the technical quality of the instruments that are being used and their sensitivity. Even the slightest change in your instrument as you're moving through your study or from what you plan to do could make a huge difference. And so you need to be really aware of those as you read studies and analyze them. Treatment replications are strength. And the easiest way to think of this one is, how much is enough? How much is needed? And I put a measuring cup here because this comes out a lot in drug studies when we're in the medical world, when they're looking at the efficacy of a particular drug and a particular dosage. It could be in educational research that your intervention was not strong enough, long enough, deep enough, and so you've missed being able to capture any results from it. And then going the other way too, how strong does it need to be to show results, or are we wasting time? But that's not particularly a threat to internal validity. Regression towards the mean. And this goes back to your basic statistics class where you learned about a bell curve. The tendency in a large group is for the group to be very alike. And over time, subjects do become more homogeneous. Not the people, but statistically when you look at it. Those with extreme scores, for whatever reason, when you give them a post-test, they may not replicate the extreme score that they got. And this is another time when large samples can really, really help. Another threat to internal validity, and remember, internal validity means you're capturing reality. This is diffusion, and what it is a leak. It's when the leak from your intervention or whatever you're trying to introduce actually leaks into your control group or into different levels of your intervention. I kind of think of this like talk in the teacher's lounge. Hey, I'm trying out this new thing for this researcher, and the kids seem to be responding to it really well. Oh, well, what are you doing? I think I'll try that with my kids too, and or some version of like that happens. Kids talk too. So the subjects can actually talk unless they're in total isolation somehow. Friends on a bus. Hey, look at these 4 steps my teacher taught us for doing this particular kind of math problem. Hey, that's cool. I'm glad you showed me that. And then it's diffused into your control group. Another threat to whether your results actually show reality is actually the influence of the experimenter. Experimenters have biases. We have expectations of different kinds of students or different groups of students or different schools. All of those can influence, and you need to be really sensitive to that as you read and analyze research articles. In addition, the experimenter could simply be irritating to the kids and they shut down. Could have a really strong accent that children find hard to follow. I'm trying to think of all these things. Could be physically dissimilar from the group. You may have a very diverse group racially, and then you have a white guy with a tie walk in and start asking the kids questions. And all of those are going to introduce things that get in the way of this being a snapshot of reality. Then there are subject effects, and these are huge to internal validity. You've probably heard of the Hawthorne effect. That was when some factory workers, they figured out that they were being studied, and they worked harder during the study because they were simply being studied, and so they performed better. And you can honestly have that happen in research also. Then there's the John Henry effect, which is when the control group finds out they're in the control group and we're going to show you, and they work harder just to prove that they're capable or whatever is going on in their brains. You can have a group of subjects who are resentful, and that causes they're demoralized. They may feel left out, and they may even see some benefit that the treatment group is getting, and that really makes them frustrated, resentful, or they become unwilling and difficult to work with. And then there's kind of the novelty effect also. And this can make it so that what you're finding is not a snapshot of real life. Novelties tend to energize people because it's new and different and exciting and fun, or it's out of the routine. And all of those mean that you have to question your results as a snapshot of reality. Now, there are solutions to each of these. All of them will not be threats in every study, and you're actually trying to get as few threats as possible in your design study, so you have to look at the ones that apply. For example, with history, you can acknowledge that. You can choose the context. Selection, keep it random. Maturation, you can design for the time that your study takes and consider the developmental aspects. Pretesting, a good use would be to have a bank of questions and they simply get divided up among the pre and the post test. Maybe you overlap them by 1/3 or something like that so that it's more fair as you look at a snapshot of reality. We've talked about instrumentation, and we will talk about that more in a few weeks when we talk about sensitivity and the appropriateness of your instrumentation. Replications, you need to do pre-studies and know your research so well that you know how strong that intervention needs to be in order to show some results. You have to get familiar with the power of your study. Attrition, as I said earlier, it really helps if your sample size can be large enough, but it's not as easy as you think to get a large sample size sometimes. Regression, there again, if you've got a large enough sample size, you can control this one statistically, but it's so much more valid, internally valid, when the researcher acknowledges this and says what they did to statistically control for that. When you're looking at diffusion, you need to think about how much do the subjects need to know, and will they even be able to share with each other? If you're going to randomize children within one classroom, for example, they're going to talk with each other between the pre-test and the post-test. It should be really interesting. Experimenter effects, you can design that into your study so that perhaps the teacher is administering the intervention, but there again, then you've got an instrumentation threat. So you have to balance these and decide which is the best way to go. And last of all, your subject effects and how much do they need to know about what's happening and how important it is to not share it, especially perhaps the teacher of the class should be in on this, and the teacher of the control group should know how important the control group is to it. Now, external validity, when you try to take your results and generalize those to another group, there are just two types of threats in general for this that are really important. First of all, there's population threats. You have to look at the specifics of the sample. If you do a study in an urban area and then someone wants to generalize that to all students in the United States, that validity is simply not there. That's a huge threat to the validity. If you want to be able to generalize to students in the United States, you need to make sure that your sample mirrors the population that you want to draw conclusions about. And then sometimes there's not consistency across subgroups even, and you have some threats to your external validity with the subgroups. You have to look at how your subjects are enrolled. If they volunteered and they wanted to participate in this study, say you advertise a study for really smart people, and you'll have them coming out of the woodwork and wanting to participate in your study, it's going to be hard for that to have external validity and generalize it to honestly intelligent people across the United States, for example. The other threat is an ecological validity threat. And this is about the settings and the conditions. It can be the way the treatment was provided. For example, if you're going to bring students into a lab to do something on a computer and you're going to study their eye movement as they're reading a book, for example, that's great, but there's a threat to the validity of taking that and generalizing it out to the entire third grade population in a state or something like that. The instruments that are used could be a threat to the external validity. Even the time of day, children may be more awake after lunch. There was just a study came out that said that our high schoolers shouldn't be starting their morning until 10 a.m. Which sounds good to some of us who have taught high school, and I'm sure some of you are on board with that. But all of these mean that you can't, the setting and the conditions mean that you can't take your results and generalize them to an outside population. So what's really important is when you're reading, look for a good description of the procedures and question, throw in these threats. Is there possibly a threat to the external or the internal validity, and what is it?